25 parents. 25 moments where waiting was no longer an option. These are the stories of ordinary mothers and fathers who decided that if the system would not deliver justice for their children, they would do it themselves. Some walked free. Some went to prison. All of them made a choice you will spend the rest of this video asking yourself if you would have made too. Welcome to Primetime Crime. Warning: the stories presented in this documentary are based on real events and real people. Some details have been condensed for narrative clarity. This video does not condone or encourage vigilante justice in any form. All content is presented strictly for informational and educational purposes. Viewers' discretion is advised. Gary Plauché, The Airport Execution, Louisiana, 1984. Jeff Doucet ran a karate studio in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Parents trusted him completely. He was patient, friendly, and great with kids. Jody Plauché was one of his students, an 11-year-old boy who thought Doucet was the coolest adult he knew. That trust was a lie. For months, Doucet had been grooming Jody in secret, slowly pulling him closer, crossing lines so gradually that the boy never saw it happening. And then one day in February 1984, Doucet disappeared. He took Jody with him. Police tracked them to a motel room in Anaheim, California. Doucet had driven the boy across state lines. What he had done to Jody in that motel room was unspeakable. Officers recovered Jody. Doucet was arrested and put in handcuffs. And somewhere back in Louisiana, a father named Gary Plauché received a phone call that hollowed him out completely. Nobody who knew Gary would have called him a violent man. He was quiet, ordinary, the kind of dad who showed up to every game and never made a scene. But something shifted in him the moment he learned what had been done to his son. A door closed, a decision was made, and Gary kept it entirely to himself. Doucet was flown back to Baton Rouge to face charges. It was big news. Local TV cameras were set up at the airport, pointed at the arrival gate, ready to capture the moment. Deputies flanked Doucet as he came through the terminal. Everyone was watching the perp walk. Nobody was watching the man in the baseball cap standing near a payphone. Gary Plauché had been there for a while, waiting, patient as ever. When Doucet came into view, Gary stepped out. He raised a small pistol. He fired one shot into the side of Doucet's head. The cameras caught every second of it. Doucet dropped. He died shortly after. The footage aired on national television and spread everywhere. People watched it on repeat. Gary didn't run. He stood still and let officers take him down. At sentencing, Gary received no prison time, a suspended sentence and 7 years of probation. The courtroom, the jury, and most of the country understood something that was hard to put into words but easy to feel. Years later, Jody Plauché grew up and wrote a book about what happened. He said he forgave Jeff Doucet. He never once said his father was wrong. The Texas barn, father. No name, no charges. Texas, 2012. Picture a regular Saturday afternoon in rural Texas. Burgers on the grill, kids running around the yard, and families standing around talking about nothing important. The kind of afternoon where nothing bad is supposed to happen because nothing bad ever happens at a cookout with people you know. A 23-year-old father was having exactly that kind of afternoon. His daughter, just 5 years old, was somewhere nearby playing, and everything was fine until he heard her scream. He ran toward the sound and traced it to the barn at the edge of the property. What he found inside stopped the world. A 47-year-old ranch hand named Jesus Mora Flores had his daughter pinned to the ground and was sexually assaulting her. The father had no weapon. He grabbed Flores with his hands and started hitting him with his fists. He hit him the way any parent in that moment would hit someone, with every ounce of strength his body had. He didn't stop, not until Flores was no longer moving. Then the silence hit. He stepped back, looked at what had happened, picked up his phone and called 911. The recording of that call is difficult to listen to. He was begging the dispatcher to send an ambulance. His voice kept breaking. He didn't want this man to die, he just wanted someone to come. Jesus Mora Flores was pronounced dead at the scene. The Lavaca County Grand Jury reviewed the evidence and declined to indict the father. No charges, no trial. The decision was simple under Texas law because deadly force is legally permitted to stop a sexual assault in progress. 12 ordinary people sat in a room and decided this father had done nothing wrong. His name was never released publicly. It was kept out of all official records to protect his daughter's identity. He remains anonymous to this day, somewhere in Texas, living a life that was permanently divided into before and after by what happened in that barn. The case became one of the most talked about legal stories of 2012. People across the country read about it and had the same reaction. They didn't need a law degree to understand why. Jason Browning, the babysitter, Beatdown, Florida, 2014. Jason Browning needed someone to watch his 11-year-old son for a few hours, and so he called Raymond Frolander, an 18-year-old who had babysat for the family before without any issues. Jason headed out feeling fine about it. No red flags, no bad feeling in his gut. Just a normal night. He came home to something that will never leave him. Raymond Frolander was in the living room sexually assaulting Jason's son. Jason crossed that room, and what happened next took seconds. He hit Frolander repeatedly until Frolander was on the floor barely conscious. Then he picked up his phone and dialed 911. Jason told the dispatcher what he had come home to. He told them what he had done. He said he had beaten the babysitter and that they needed to come. His voice was steady in a way that felt more frightening than screaming would have. When police arrived and saw Frolander, they took photos. The mugshot that came from that night spread across the internet within hours. Bloodied, swollen, staring at nothing. The comments section under every article posting that photo told you everything you needed to know about how the public felt. Nobody charged Jason Browning. The Volusia County Sheriff went on camera personally to say there was nothing to charge. As far as law enforcement was concerned, Jason had walked into his own home and stopped a crime in progress. Raymond Frolander pleaded guilty to sexual battery of a child under 12. The judge sentenced him to 25 years with no possibility of parole. There is one detail from that night that people always come back to. At some point while Jason was hitting Frolander, his son reportedly begged him to stop. The boy was scared his father would go too far and get in trouble. Jason said later that his son saved Frolander's life that night. That detail right there says more than any verdict ever could. Miriam Rodriguez Martinez, the mother who hunted the cartel, Mexico, 2014 to 2017. Karen was everything. That is the only way to understand what her mother did after she was gone. What Miriam Rodriguez Martinez did in the 3 years following her daughter's murder was not something a normal person does. It was not something a trained law enforcement officer does. It was something only a mother with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to put her grief could do. Karen Rodriguez was kidnapped by members of the Zetas cartel in 2014 in Tamaulipas, Mexico. The family paid the ransom. Every peso they demanded. They did everything the kidnappers asked and trusted that compliance would bring Karen home. But the cartel killed her anyway. Miriam went to authorities. She reported everything, cooperated fully, and when the investigation stalled the way investigations in cartel-controlled regions of Mexico tend to stall, she made a decision that most people would not survive making. She was going to find the people responsible herself. She did not hire investigators. She became one. She used disguises, created fake identities, and used them to get close to people connected to the network that had taken Karen. She conducted surveillance on cartel members in a region where simply knowing too much about the wrong people was enough to get you killed. One by one, she located the individuals responsible for her daughter's kidnapping and murder. One by one, she handed their names and locations to Mexican federal authorities. She tracked down 10 cartel members this way. 10. On Mother's Day, 2017, Miriam Rodriguez Martinez was at her home in San Fernando, still on crutches from an injury sustained while pursuing a suspect. A group of men arrived at her door. She was shot 12 times. She died before the ambulance reached the hospital. Mexico mourned her publicly. The story spread internationally, and the reaction was the same everywhere. Here was a woman who had walked deliberately into one of the most dangerous criminal networks on the planet, armed with nothing but disguises, and a mother's refusal to let her daughter's killers disappear back into the dark. She had succeeded where institutions had failed. She had done it alone, and the cartel had eventually done what cartels do to people who make themselves a problem. Miriam Rodriguez Martinez was buried in the same country that could not protect her daughter and could not protect her. She found 10 of them anyway. Sarah Sands, The Kitchen Knife, East London, United Kingdom, 2014. The man Sarah Sands knew as Michael Plauché was a familiar face on the estate in East London where she lived with her children. Friendly, grandfatherly. The kind of older neighbor who seemed harmless enough that parents did not think twice about him being around. His real name was Robin Molt. He had changed it specifically to bury a record that included 24 prior sexual offense convictions. The system that was supposed to flag these things had not flagged this one. He was free, present, and operating behind a new name in a community full of children. He abused Sarah's 3 sons. Police were called, Robin was charged, and then he was released on bail, allowed to return to the same estate, the same streets, the same proximity to the boys he had already been charged with abusing, and to every other child living there. Sarah watched him come back. She watched him walk around like the charges against him were a minor inconvenience. She thought about her sons having to stand up in a courtroom and testify about what he had done to them in graphic detail, while Plauché sat across from them. She thought about what that would cost them. She went to his flat with a kitchen knife. Her stated intention was to confront him and get him to confess so her boys would not have to testify. Whether that was ever a realistic outcome is a separate question from why she went there. Plauché called her sons liars. Sarah Sands then stabbed him 8 times till he bled to death in his flat. She walked to the police station afterward, still covered in his blood, and turned herself in. She told officers exactly what she had done and why. She was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 7.5 years. She served only 4. When Sarah was released, she immediately began campaigning to close the legal loophole that had allowed Plauché to change his name and hide his record from the community he moved into. She turned her sentence into a cause. The loophole she identified is now a matter of active public record in the UK. Robin Molt had the 24 prior convictions and a new name. Sarah Sands had a kitchen knife and 3 sons. The estate never saw him again. Ellie Nesler, The Courthouse Shot. California, USA, 1993. Ellie Nesler watched her 6-year-old son vomiting into a bag outside the courthouse and made her decision right there. William Nesler was a child who had been sodomized by a man named Daniel Mark Driver at a Christian summer camp. Daniel was not an unknown risk. He had prior convictions for child sexual abuse, but had been trusted with children anyway, and he had done what predators do when they are trusted with children. The preliminary hearing was underway in a Tuolumne County courtroom in 1993. William was outside and could not stop being sick. Inside, Daniel Driver was present and watching the proceedings with the kind of composure that felt to everyone who witnessed it like something much closer to arrogance. He then smirked. Ellie Nesler saw it, reached into her sister's purse, and pulled out a .25 caliber pistol. She walked up behind Daniel Driver and shot him 5 times in the head in open court in front of lawyers, a judge, and a room full of people. Driver died while Ellie stood there and did not run. She said afterward, with a clarity that has stayed in the public record ever since, that maybe she was not God, but she was the closest thing to it that Driver was going to see that day. Ellie was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years. She served 3 before being released on appeal. The story did not end cleanly. In the years that followed, Ellie struggled. She was arrested on methamphetamine charges. Her son William grew up carrying everything that had happened to him, and in 2004, he killed a man and went to prison himself. Ellie Nesler was diagnosed with cancer and died in 2008. There is a version of this story that people want it to be. A mother who protected her son, a predator who finally faced something real, a courtroom moment that felt like justice even if it was not legal. The full story is harder than that. William Nesler did not get to grow up unburdened just because his mother shot the man who hurt him. Trauma does not work that way. The bullet ended Driver. It did not end what Driver had done. Ellie Nesler went to her grave, having done the most extreme thing a mother can do in a courthouse. Whether it gave her son any peace is the question the headlines never fully answered. J. Maynor, 40 years. For Julia, Alabama, USA, 2014. Raymond Earl Brooks had already been through the system once. In 2002, he pleaded guilty to sexually abusing Julia Maynor when she was 8 years old. The abuse had been real and documented and prosecuted. Brooks received a 5-year sentence and served 27 months of it. He was then released, registered as a sex offender, and he went on with his life. Julia went on with hers too, the way survivors do, carrying something heavy that most people around her could not see. 12 years passed. In 2014, Julia said something to her father, Jay, in a moment of anger. Something about what Brooks had done to her. Something that had been sitting inside her since she was 8 years old and finally came out. Jay Maynor heard it and felt 12 years of quiet collapse into a single point. He got on his motorcycle, drove to Raymond Earl Brooks's house and shot him dead in the front yard. He also drove to another address that day, a man he suspected of abusing his stepdaughter, and fired at him as well. That man survived. Jay Maynor was arrested. He faced charges that carried significant prison time. He pleaded guilty. Not because he regretted what he had done, but because a trial would have required Julia to testify in open court about the abuse in explicit detail, and Jay Maynor decided his daughter had already been through enough. He took 40 years to protect her from having to say it out loud in front of strangers one more time. Julia spoke publicly after sentencing. She said her father had done what a father was supposed to do. She said she loved him. A petition for his clemency gathered thousands of signatures from people across the country who had read the case and arrived at the same conclusion Julia had. Jay Maynor is serving 40 years in an Alabama prison. Brooks was convicted of abusing Julia in 2002 and served 27 months. Jay Maynor shot him in 2014 and received 40 years. Those two numbers sit next to each other in this case, and they do not resolve into anything comfortable no matter how long you look at them. Julia knows her father is in prison because of her. She has said she carries that. She has also said she understands why he got on that motorcycle. Kimberly Cunningham, 10 shots, Tennessee, USA, 2003. Kimberly Cunningham's daughter Amanda had been keeping a secret for 7 years. She was 9 years old when Coy Hundley first raped her. He was her aunt's boyfriend, a presence in the family. Someone Amanda had been taught to be around, to be polite to treat like a trusted adult. He used every bit of that access for 7 years. When Amanda was 16, she finally told her mother. Kimberly Cunningham heard what her daughter said and felt the ground disappear. 7 years, her 9-year-old daughter. A man she had allowed into proximity with her child. She got in her car and drove to Coy Hundley's workplace. She told herself on the way there that if he showed any remorse, if he showed any humanity at all when she confronted him, she would let the legal process handle it. But he laughed at her when she got there. Coy looked Kimberly Cunningham in the eye and said, "What are you going to do about it?" She then pulled out a gun and shot him 5 times. He went down, she reloaded, and shot him 5 more times. 10 shots in total. She drove herself directly to the sheriff's office and turned herself in. The first jury deadlocked. They could not reach a unanimous verdict on the murder charge. A second trial produced a conviction for voluntary manslaughter instead. She was sentenced to 4 years, which was later reduced on appeal to 6 months. 6 months for 10 shots into the man who spent 7 years raping her 9-year-old daughter. The sentencing sparked enormous debate in Tennessee and nationally. Some legal commentators argued the reduction sent a dangerous message about vigilante justice. Others pointed out that 12 jurors had twice looked at Coy Hundley's actions and Kimberly Cunningham's response and found it impossible to treat her as a straightforward criminal. "What are you going to do about it?" He said that to a mother who had just learned her daughter had been raped for 7 years starting at age 9. He said it like the answer was nothing, like there was no possible response that could touch him. 10 shots said otherwise. Tammy Lee Gibson, The Bat, Washington State, USA, 2009. When Level 3 sex offender William Baldwin moved into the neighborhood in Washington State, local authorities distributed flyers. They notified residents the way the law required them to notify residents. They put his face and his offense history into the hands of the community and trusted that information was enough to keep people safe. Tammy Lee Gibson received one of those flyers. She looked at it, looked at her children, and decided that a piece of paper was not sufficient protection against the man whose photograph was on it. Gibson believed Baldwin had molested her children. The details of what she had witnessed or been told by her kids had brought her to a place where the flyer in her hand and the man it described felt like an active, ongoing threat rather than a registered historical fact. She then went to the house where Baldwin was staying with his uncle with a baseball bat. She beat him with it until he was in serious condition. Baldwin survived, but the attack was severe enough that Gibson faced charges that could have sent her to prison for years. She received 3 months. When she walked out of the sentencing hearing, she told reporters she would do it again. She said only that next time she would do it better. Christian and Alejandro Trevino, the brothers, Texas, USA. Christian and Alejandro Trevino, the brothers, Texas, USA, 2022. Christian was 18. Alejandro was 17. They heard what their little half-sister said about Gabriel Quintanilla and processed it the way teenage brothers process something like that when it involves a 9-year-old girl they love. They went to find him. What made this case even more explosive before a single punch was thrown was the detail that emerged when police started pulling records. Gabriel Quintanilla already had an outstanding warrant, not a minor one. An active warrant for continuous sexual assault of a child from a completely separate case dating back to 2019. He had been walking around Texas with that warrant attached to his name, living in a house with a 9-year-old girl, and nobody had come to collect him. The brothers confronted Quintanilla at the house. A fight broke out and he ran while the brothers chased him. They caught him and fought him again. Then they got a friend involved and found him a third time. By the end of it, Quintanilla was in a field. He died from his injuries. Christian and Alejandro were arrested and charged. The story hit the internet, and the reaction was unlike almost anything a local Texas case had generated in years. A petition demanding the brothers be released and all charges dropped gathered nearly 500,000 signatures. People from across the country who had read about the outstanding warrant from 2019 could not get past the central fact that the system had already known about Quintanilla and had not acted. Christian received a 10-year sentence. Alejandro's charges were eventually dropped. A friend involved in the third confrontation received probation. Nearly 500,000 people signed a piece of paper saying the wrong people were being punished. This case sits at the intersection of every argument this documentary raises, and raises them loudest. Two teenage brothers heard their 9-year-old sister describe what was being done to her. The man responsible had an active warrant for doing the same thing to someone else. The state knew he existed and had not found him. Christian and Alejandro found him in a single afternoon. One of them is serving 10 years for it. The other came home. Their sister is alive, and the man who hurt her is not. Texas drew its own conclusions. Nearly 500,000 people drew theirs. Aaron Spencer, The Night Chase, Arkansas, 2024. A man checked his daughter's room at 1 a.m. and found out the bed was empty. For most parents, that would be terrifying, but for Aaron Spencer it was something worse, because he already knew who had her. Spencer was an Army veteran living in Arkansas. His 13-year-old daughter had been at the center of a case that had been grinding through the court system for months. A man named Michael Faulkner was facing 43 criminal charges connected to her. Sexual assault was among them. Faulkner had been released on a $5,000 bond. $5,000. With 43 charges against him. He had a court order telling him to stay away from the family, and he was out walking around because someone decided $5,000 was enough to guarantee he would behave himself. It wasn't. Aaron called 911 the moment he found the empty bed. He told them what he suspected. And then he got in his car and drove into the dark. He found Faulkner's truck. He chased it. He rammed it off the road, and a confrontation followed. When it was over, Michael Faulkner was dead, and Aaron Spencer's daughter was pulled out of that truck by her father. Aaron stayed at the scene. He called 911 again and waited for the police. Prosecutors later charged him with second-degree murder anyway. The backlash was huge. A fundraiser for his legal defense filled up in days. Supporters crowded outside the courthouse, and people who had never heard of Arkansas were sharing his name online and demanding to know how a father who rescued his daughter from a man with 43 charges against her was the one sitting in a jail cell. And then Aaron Spencer did something nobody expected. He announced he was running for county sheriff while out on bail. His trial is still pending as of early 2025. Faulkner had 43 charges, a no-contact order, and a $5,000 bail. Spencer's daughter was in his truck at 1 a.m. The jury who eventually hears this case will have to look at all of that and decide what justice actually means. Marianne Bachmeier. Courtroom Assassination, Germany, 1981. Klaus Grabowski had a file, a thick one. Convicted sex offender. Prior abuse of children. He was castrated as part of a legal arrangement with German courts, then quietly given hormone treatments that reversed the procedure entirely. All of this known, documented, and sitting in a government folder somewhere, while Klaus Grabowski lived freely in a neighborhood in Lupe, West Germany. A girl named Anna Bachmeier was 7 years old and had lived nearby. In 1980, Anna disappeared. She had gone to Grabowski's home, and what he did to her inside that house was the kind of thing that makes people question every comfortable assumption they have ever held about how society protects its children. He strangled her afterward and hid her body in a cardboard box. Grabowski was arrested, and his trial began in 1981. Anna's mother, Marianne, attended every single session. She sat in that courtroom day after day and watched the legal machinery process her daughter's murder with the cold efficiency of a system that treats every case the same, regardless of what it costs the people sitting in the gallery. She listened to arguments. She watched Grabowski's defense team work. She kept coming back. Then Grabowski said something during the proceedings that cracked the floor open beneath her. He claimed Anna had threatened to tell people he had touched her. He implied, in open court, with judges and lawyers and journalists present, that a 7-year-old child had somehow been a participant in the circumstances of her own death. He was blaming Anna. On March 6, 1981, Marianne Bachmeier arrived at the Lubeck Regional Court carrying a Beretta pistol she had purchased in the weeks prior. She sat through the morning proceedings and waited until Grabowski had his back to her. Then she stood up, walked forward, and fired 8 shots. 6 bullets struck him. He collapsed and died from his wounds. The footage and photographs from that courtroom spread internationally within hours. Here was a mother, in a gray coat, in a functioning courtroom in a modern democracy, who had just executed her daughter's killer in front of a judge. Germany did not agree on how to feel about it. Feminist groups argued she had done what the state refused to do. Legal scholars argued that everything the justice system stood for collapsed the moment individuals could decide who deserved to die and walk into a courtroom to enforce that decision. Both arguments were genuine. Neither fully canceled the other out. Marianne was convicted of manslaughter and was sentenced to 6 years but served just over 3. She gave interviews for years afterward. She never performed remorse she did not feel. She said she had not planned it until the moment Grabowski blamed her daughter, and that once he did, the decision made itself. Marianne Bachmeier died of pancreatic cancer in 1996. Anna was 7 years old when Klaus Grabowski put her in a cardboard box. Her mother made sure the last thing he ever saw was someone who remembered that. Jeffrey Giuliano, The Masked Intruder, Connecticut, 2012. This is the most tragic case on this entire list. Not because of what Jeffrey Giuliano did, but because of who was on the other side of it. It was 2 a.m. on a September night in Connecticut when Jeffrey heard his daughter screaming from outside the house. The sound of a child screaming in the middle of the night is something a parent's body responds to before the mind has fully caught up. Jeffrey grabbed his gun and went outside. There was a figure in the dark, dressed in black and wearing a mask. The figure was not responding normally, not retreating, not explaining itself, and so Jeffrey fired. When he got close enough to see who was on the ground, Jeffrey Giuliano's world ended in a completely different way than he had feared it would 30 seconds earlier. The masked intruder was his own son. Tyler Giuliano was 15 years old. He had been struggling with serious mental health issues for some time. Issues the family had been trying to navigate, trying to get help for, trying to manage with the combination of love and desperation that parents of children in crisis know too well. What Tyler was doing outside at 2 a.m. in a black mask was something that has never been fully explained publicly. Whether it was a mental health episode, a cry for intervention, or something else entirely, is something only Tyler knew, and Tyler was gone. Jeffrey Giuliano called 911 immediately. He told them exactly what had happened and that he had shot his son. A Connecticut state attorney reviewed the case and determined that Jeffrey had acted in reasonable defense of himself and his daughter, given what he knew and could see at the moment he fired. No charges were filed, no charges, no prison, no legal consequence for Jeffrey Giuliano. Just a father who went outside to protect his daughter and came back inside having killed his son. Kenneth Faulkner, The Tennessee Trap, Tennessee Kenneth Faulkner's two daughters were 4 and 7 years old. He had begun to suspect that a 67-year-old man named William Thomas, who was close to the family, had been sexually abusing them. Thomas was the kind of man nobody suspects because he was already inside the circle of trust, comfortable in the home and familiar with the children. Faulkner went to police and told them what he believed was happening, but the investigation moved slowly because evidence involving young children was difficult to gather. Disclosures took time, and the legal process had its own pace that does not always match the urgency a parent feels when they believe their child was being harmed right now. So Faulkner stopped waiting. He reached out to Thomas directly and arranged a meeting. The exact details of how he lured him vary across reports, but what is consistent is this. Faulkner set the meeting up deliberately, brought Thomas to a location where he could confront him without interference, and when he arrived, Faulkner physically attacked him. He was arrested and charged with assault. The confrontation that he had engineered so carefully ended with him in handcuffs instead of the man he believed had hurt his daughters. But here is where the story turns. The suspect was also later charged. The assault case against Faulkner and the abuse case against Thomas moved through the system simultaneously. 2 men, 2 sets of charges, 1 family at the center of all of it. The public debate around this case kept circling back to one uncomfortable reality. Faulkner had gone to the authorities first. He had done what you are supposed to do. He had reported it and waited. And when the waiting felt like it was costing his daughters something they could not get back, he stopped trusting the process and started trusting himself. That decision cost him, but it also forced the case into the open in a way that a slow investigation might not have. Kenneth Faulkner is not a clean hero. He made choices that complicated everything and hurt his own legal standing. But he is also a father who looked at his 4-year-old and 7-year-old daughters and decided that no procedure or timeline was more important than stopping what he believed was happening to them. Most parents sitting at home watching this would struggle to say they would have done differently. Stephen Vollrath, The Thumb Case, Alberta, Canada, 2015. There is no other case in Canadian legal history quite like this one. The judge said so himself during sentencing. He searched through the records and could not find a single comparable example anywhere in the country. What Stephen Vollrath did was so specific, so planned, and so bizarre that it exists in its own category entirely. It started with a tragedy that had nothing to do with Vollrath directly. In 2013, a man named Richard Suter was in his vehicle when he accidentally pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. His car jumped a curb and plowed into a restaurant patio in Edmonton. A 2-year-old boy named Gio Mountseff was killed, and several other people were injured. Suter was charged because he had been drinking. The case went through the courts, and when the sentence came down, many people in the community felt it did not come close to matching the gravity of what had happened. A child was dead. His family was destroyed. And the punishment felt to a lot of people like the system had quietly decided that accidental death had a discount attached to it. Stephen Vollrath was one of those people. He was not related to the Mountseff family. He was not a close friend. He was just someone who watched what happened and felt a rage he could not release through normal channels. So he built a plan. He obtained a police uniform, recruited 2 accomplices, and on a winter night he went to Richard Suter's home, presented himself as a police officer, and told Suter he needed to come with him. Suter complied. They drove him to a remote snowy field outside the city. It was cold. Suter was in his bathrobe. Vollrath produced a pair of pruning shears and cut off Suter's thumb. Then they left him there, unconscious, in the snow, in his bathrobe, in an Alberta winter. Suter managed to survive. He was found and treated. Vollrath and his accomplices were later identified, arrested, and charged. Stephen Vollrath was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The Alberta Court of Appeal reviewed the case and noted in their written decision that they had been unable to locate a single precedent in Canadian legal history for this specific type of crime. It is a deeply strange case. Vollrath had no personal connection to the child who died. He was not a grieving father or a devastated family member. He was someone who decided that justice had failed a 2-year-old boy he had never met, and that he was going to correct that failure himself with a garden tool in a snowy field. Barry Gilton and Lupe Mercado, The Pimp Problem, San Francisco, 2012. This one is different from the others. No courtroom vindication, no suspended sentence, no grand jury deciding the parents did the right thing. This story ends with 2 parents behind bars. It belongs on this list anyway because it asks the hardest question of all. Barry Gilton and Lupe Mercado had a 17-year-old daughter named Sienna. At some point, she got involved with a 22-year-old man named Calvin Sneed. Sneed was not a boyfriend. He was a trafficker. He was posting Sienna on escort websites and making money off her. Her parents found out. They begged her to come home. They called family members to reach her, tried every way they could think of to pull her back, but Sienna wouldn't leave Sneed. Sienna was 17 years old and completely under his control. Barry and Lupe ran out of options, so they went to find Calvin Sneed themselves. The confrontation ended with Sneed shot and killed. Both parents were arrested, charged with first-degree murder, convicted and sent to prison. Here is where it gets even harder. Sienna did not react to Sneed's death the way you might expect a trafficking victim to react when her trafficker is gone. She grieved him, because that is what trauma bonding looks like up close. She lost Sneed, and she lost her parents in the same week. Barry and Lupe Mercado sit in prison right now for killing the man who was selling their teenage daughter. A lot of parents watching this would understand exactly why they did it, even if they would never do the same. Jonathan Robles, The Family Vigilante, Ontario, Canada, 2014. The judge called him a family vigilante. He said it from the bench during sentencing, in a formal courtroom, with the weight of the law behind every word. And yet somehow, the phrase did not land the way a condemnation is supposed to land. Because once you know what Jonathan Robles lived through, those 2 words feel less like a verdict and more like an explanation. Jonathan grew up in a home built on fear. His father, Tony, was not simply a difficult man. He was a predator with a documented history of violence and sexual abuse that stretched back decades and ran through his own family like a current nobody could escape. Multiple relatives had been affected due to his criminal history. He used a firearm to control people around him. He made threats that everyone who knew him understood were not empty. Jonathan became an adult. He had children of his own. And Tony was still there. Still a presence. Still a threat. Then new charges came. Charges involving young relatives again. Jonathan sat through meetings with prosecutors. He listened carefully to everything the legal process had to say about timelines and evidence and the way these things needed to unfold. He nodded. He waited. And then he looked at his own children and made a calculation that no courtroom procedure could talk him out of. He went to his father's home one day carrying an audio recorder. The stated plan was to get Tony on tape, to extract a confession that could be used against him. Whether Jonathan believed that plan when he walked through the door, or whether the plan had already changed before he got there, is something only he knows. Security cameras outside the property recorded what happened. Jonathan attacked his father. Tony Robles died from the injuries he sustained. Jonathan did not construct an alibi. He did not run. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and stood before a judge who had to sentence him under Canadian law while also looking at the full picture of what had produced this moment. The judge gave him the minimum sentence available. He referenced the decades of abuse. He acknowledged the fear Jonathan had carried for his children. He used the phrase family vigilante, not to dismiss what Jonathan had done, but to describe it with a precision that a standard legal category could not quite capture. Jonathan Robles went to prison. He accepted that. But the sentence he received told a quiet story about what the court understood when it looked past the act itself and into the lifetime that had led there. The minimum was not leniency, it was honesty. Andrei Bamberski, the 30-year kidnapping, France and Germany, 1982 to 2009. Andrei Bamberski's daughter, Kalinka, was 14 years old when she died in Bavaria in 1982 while staying with her mother and stepfather, a German physician named Dieter Krombach. The official explanation was cardiac failure, but Kalinka had no heart condition. She was a healthy teenager. An autopsy told a different story. Evidence of a sedative called carbutamide injected into her system, and evidence of sexual assault. A French investigation was opened. In 1995, a French court convicted Krombach in absentia of causing Kalinka's death through negligence and sentenced him to 15 years. Krombach was in Germany, and Germany refused to extradite its own citizens for crimes committed on German soil. He was protected not by innocence, but by geography and a legal technicality. He kept his medical license and kept practicing. He kept living. Andrei Bamberski filed complaints across multiple jurisdictions. He pursued the European Court of Human Rights, lobbied French politicians, and hired lawyers in both countries simultaneously. He generated enough legal pressure that Krombach was eventually banned from practicing medicine, but that was only the ceiling. The border held. The man who killed his daughter remained untouchable. 27 years of this. In 2009, Andrei Bamberski hired a group of men to cross that border and do what European law would not. They went to Krombach's home in Germany and abducted him. They then drove him across the French border and left him outside the courthouse in Mulhouse. Bound and beaten, dressed only in the clothes he had been wearing when they grabbed him. French police found him there and took him directly into custody. Dieter Krombach stood trial in a French court. He was convicted of the violent rape and manslaughter of Kalinka Bamberski. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Andrei Bamberski was convicted of organizing the kidnapping. He received a suspended sentence and served no prison time. The French court was aware of what he had done and aware of why he had done it, and the sentence reflected both of those things simultaneously. Reporters asked him afterward whether he felt any conflict about stepping outside the law after spending so many years working within it. He said he had given the system 27 years, and the system had given him a border and a shrug. Kalinka was 14. Her father was in his 70s before anyone was held to account for what happened to her. He spent the years in between refusing to let the distance between France and Germany mean that nobody ever would be. Randall Margraves, 1 minute, Michigan, 2018. Larry Nassar fooled everyone. He was the most trusted sports doctor in America. Parents drove their daughters to his clinic from across the country. Olympic coaches vouched for him, and USA Gymnastics put him on a pedestal. He had credentials, awards, and a reputation that made questioning him feel almost disrespectful. For decades, he used every single bit of that trust to sexually abuse young girls under the guise of medical treatment. Over 150 survivors came forward. 150. 3 of them were Randall Margraves' daughters. In January 2018, Nassar's sentencing hearing was underway in a Michigan courtroom. One by one, survivors were given the opportunity to deliver impact statements directly to the man who had abused them. It was an extraordinary and painful process that stretched across several days. Randall sat in that courtroom and listened to his daughters walk to that podium and describe out loud in front of strangers and cameras exactly what Nassar had done to their bodies while their parents trusted him completely. When it was his turn to speak, he had 1 minute. Just 1 minute with that man. The video spread everywhere within hours. Hundreds of millions of people watched it on repeat. The reaction was the same in every language and every country. Nobody needed it explained to them. He didn't get 1 minute. He didn't need it. The whole world already understood. Eduardo Gallo, the amateur detective, Mexico, 2000. Eduardo Gallo paid the ransom. Every peso they asked for. He followed every instruction, met every deadline, and handed over the money without involving anyone who might spook the people holding his daughter. He did everything a father is supposed to do when the kidnappers told him his compliance was the only thing keeping Paula alive. She was 16 years old. She was bright, funny, and had her whole life ahead of her. They killed her anyway. Her body was found after the money was already gone. The kidnappers had never planned to release her. Eduardo had done everything right, and it had not made a single difference because the people who took Paula had made their decision before they ever picked up the phone. Mexican authorities investigated. Eduardo cooperated fully. He answered every question, handed over every piece of information he had, and waited for the investigation to move. But it moved slowly. Leads that seemed solid went quiet. The men responsible remained unidentified. Weeks passed, then months. Eduardo shut down his consulting firm. He walked away from the business he had spent his career building, the meetings, the clients, the professional identity he had constructed over decades, and he pointed everything he had at one single objective. He was going to find the people who killed his daughter. He had no detective training, no badge, no access to law enforcement databases or official resources. What he had was money, time, and an obsessive precision that grief had sharpened into something almost frightening. He started mapping phone records, movement patterns, and the social networks around people connected to the case. He went into neighborhoods where a formal investigator with a badge would have been told nothing, because nobody there trusted authority. Eduardo was not authority. He was a father with questions and enough patience to ask them 100 times until someone answered. The breakthrough came through a payphone pattern. He had identified a suspect he believed was connected to Paula's murder. By tracking the timing and location of calls made from public phones in the area, he was able to build a picture of where this person was spending time on a consistent basis. It was the kind of granular, obsessive cartography that most people would give up on after a week. Eduardo brought what he had assembled to law enforcement. It was specific enough that investigators could not dismiss it. They followed the information he provided and located the suspect. The suspect was arrested and later confessed to the murder. Eduardo Gallo's work had directly driven the outcome. Not official resources, not forensic technology. A father with a closed business, an open calendar, and a grief that had nowhere to go except forward. He has spoken publicly about Paula since. He describes the investigation not as something heroic, but as the only thing that felt like breathing during those years. Everything else had stopped making sense. Finding the people who killed her was the only purpose that felt real. John Ramsay, The DIY Investigation, Colorado, 1996. John Ramsay spent years being treated like a suspect in his own daughter's murder. Then he spent more years trying to solve it himself. JonBenet Ramsay was 6 years old when she was found murdered in the basement of her family's home in Boulder, Colorado, on December 26, 1996. She had been reported missing that morning. Hours later, her father found her body during a police-requested search of the house. She had been strangled. The case became one of the most covered and most debated murder investigations in American history. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on the parents. John and his wife Patsy were subjected to years of public scrutiny, relentless media coverage, and an investigation that many experts later described as mishandled from the first hours. Boulder police failed to properly secure the crime scene. Evidence was compromised. The case grew cold while the Ramsays lived under a cloud that never fully lifted. Patsy Ramsay died of ovarian cancer in 2006 without ever seeing her daughter's killer identified. John was officially cleared by DNA evidence in 2008 when a profile found on JonBenet's clothing excluded both parents entirely. But John had not waited for the official clearing to start working on the case himself. He funded private investigators out of his own pocket. He commissioned independent DNA analysis years before the technology was standard in cold case work. He hired former law enforcement professionals to review the original investigation and identify what had gone wrong. He pursued leads that police had either dismissed or never followed at all. He gave interviews and wrote a book not simply to tell his story, but to apply public pressure to a case that kept getting buried. He also ran for a Michigan state legislature seat in 2004. People who covered the campaign noted that every appearance became partly about JonBenet. He never missed a chance to remind audiences that his daughter's killer had never been caught. John Ramsay's version of taking justice into his own hands looked nothing like a confrontation in an airport or a barn. It looked like a father who refused to let the institutions that had failed his family also control the narrative around that failure. He used money, media, science, and sheer persistence as his tools. The case remains officially unsolved, but the independent DNA work John pushed for has kept it alive and is still considered the most promising avenue toward an eventual answer. Stacy's Parents, The Poison Case, North Carolina, 2018. This one asks something different of you. Because the parents in this story did not confront anyone physically. They did not run a sting or chase a truck through the night. What they did was harder in its own way. They pointed the finger at their own son-in-law, and then they had to survive what came next. Stacy Hunsucker was 32 years old when she died in September 2018. Her husband Joshua was a paramedic in Cabarrus County, North Carolina. He told people that she had suffered a sudden cardiac event. Stacy had been healthy. The death was unexpected. Her family buried her and tried to grieve. But Stacy's parents could not let it go. They did not believe the cardiac explanation. Something about the circumstances did not sit right with them, and they began quietly pushing authorities to look harder at what had happened to their daughter. The Cabarrus County medical examiner eventually determined that Stacy had died from tetrahydrozoline poisoning. It is the active ingredient in certain eye drops. Ingested in sufficient quantities, it is fatal and not immediately obvious on a standard examination. Joshua Hunsucker was charged with first-degree murder. That should have been the end of the parents' ordeal. It was not even close to the end. While out on bond awaiting trial, Joshua allegedly poisoned his own young daughter using the same method. Prosecutors later argued this was an attempt to frame Stacy's parents by making them appear to be a danger to the children in their care. If the plan was to discredit the people who had pushed hardest for the investigation, it represented a level of calculated cruelty that went far beyond the original crime. The children were removed from the situation. Joshua Hunsucker was eventually convicted of Stacy's murder and received a life sentence. The case against him for the poisoning of his daughter added further charges. Stacy's parents never held a weapon. They never set a trap or chased anyone. But they did the thing that in some families is the hardest thing of all. They stood up inside a grief they were still drowning in and told the truth about the person their daughter had loved and trusted. Joe Petito, Media Warfare, New York and Wyoming, 2021. Joe Petito did not pick up a weapon. He picked up a microphone, and he used it like one. When his daughter, Gabrielle, known to millions as Gabby, went missing in August 2021 during a cross-country van trip with her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie, Joe did what any father would do first. He called, he texted, he waited for news that did not come. And then Laundrie returned home to his parents' house in Florida without Gabby, hired a lawyer, and said nothing. Gabby's body was found in Wyoming's Bridger-Teton National Forest in September 2021. She had been strangled. Laundrie disappeared shortly after becoming a person of interest. His parents said they did not know where he had gone. His remains were eventually found in a Florida nature reserve. He had died by suicide. That is where many stories end. The suspect gone, and the case technically closed. But Joe Petito decided it was not closed. The Laundrie family had stayed silent while Gabby was missing. They had said nothing publicly while Joe and his family were doing press conferences every day begging for information. They had said nothing while the entire country searched for their son's girlfriend, and when it was over they retreated back into silence. Joe filed a civil lawsuit against the Laundrie family, arguing they had known something about Gabby's fate while she was still officially missing and had withheld it. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. No admission of guilt was made publicly, but the Laundries paid. Joe did not stop there. He became one of the most vocal advocates in America for missing persons cases, particularly for cases involving people of color that he felt received a fraction of the media coverage Gabby's case had generated. He used his visibility to push for change in how media and law enforcement prioritize missing persons reports. He testified. He campaigned. He built a foundation in Gabby's name. What Joe Petito did was take the worst thing that ever happened to him and turn it into sustained, targeted pressure on every institution he believed had failed his daughter or could fail someone else's. He had no gun, no confrontation in a barn, no shower ambush. He had a camera in his face every day, and he used every second of it. Gabby Petito was 22 years old. Her father made sure the world never got comfortable forgetting that. Denise Fergus, 30 years of fighting, United Kingdom, 1993. Most parents on this list acted in a single moment of rage or desperation. Denise Fergus spent 30 years. In February 1993, her 2-year-old son, James Bolger, was taken from a shopping center in Bootle, Merseyside. He was led away by 2 10-year-old boys named Robert Thompson and John Venables. What they did to James that afternoon was so brutal that the details still shock people who read about it decades later. He was found on a railway line. He had been tortured and killed. Thompson and Venables were convicted of murder and released in 2001 under new identities protected by court order. They were teenagers by then. The court decided they deserved a chance at a normal life. Denise Fergus disagreed, loudly, publicly, for the next 3 decades. She campaigned relentlessly against the protection of their identities. She launched legal challenges against the government when Venables was recalled to prison in 2010 for possessing child abuse images, arguing the public had a right to know who he was. She fought the same battle again when he was recalled a second time in 2017 for the same reason. Each time she was told no. Each time she came back. At one point, she received a tip from a member of the public who believed they had identified one of the killers living in her area. She drove to the location herself. She later said that when she got there and thought she was looking at the man who killed her son and was completely paralyzed. She could not move. She sat in her car and eventually drove away. That detail is important because Denise Fergus is often described as someone who wanted revenge. She has always said she wanted accountability. There is a difference. and she has lived inside that difference for 3 decades. She has never stopped. She still speaks publicly. She still advocates. She turned unimaginable grief into a lifelong campaign using media, law, and sheer refusal to go quiet as her weapons. No physical confrontation. No courtroom shooting. Just a mother who decided the day her son was murdered that she was never going to let the world forget his name. Jenny Kyer, the mother they blamed, Minnesota, 2012. Before anyone talks about what Jenny Kyer did, you need to understand what she was told. She was told her daughter deserved it. Not in those exact words. Never in those exact words, but in every legal argument. Every Castle Doctrine defense. Every public comment section and courthouse corridor conversation. The message underneath was the same. Haley Kyer had broken into a house. Haley Kyer had made a choice. Haley Kyer had brought this on herself. Haley Kyer was 18 years old. On Thanksgiving Day 2012 in Little Falls, Minnesota, a 64-year-old man named Byron David Smith was sitting in his basement. He had been burglarized before, and he was prepared this time. He had a chair set up, a book to read, an audio recorder running, and 2 firearms within reach. He had planned for someone to come. Haley Kyer and her 17-year-old cousin Nick Brady came through the window. Brady came downstairs first. Smith shot him twice, and Brady fell. Smith shot him again in the face at close range to finish it, and dragged his body behind a tarp. Then he waited. Haley came downstairs calling her cousin's name. Smith shot her. She fell and tumbled down the stairs. She was still alive and laughing nervously, the way people sometimes do when their brain cannot process what is happening to their body. Smith shot her again. She was still moving. He then placed his gun under her chin and fired a final shot. He described her afterward on the recording as a bitch and said he felt no remorse whatsoever. He left both bodies in his basement over the holiday weekend and called his lawyer before he called police. Smith was arrested, charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The audio recording he had made of himself narrating the killings was played in court, and it destroyed any self-defense argument his lawyers tried to construct. Then Jenny Kyer's fight began, because conviction was not enough. Smith still owned property. He still had assets. And Patty Kyer was not willing to let the man who executed her daughter while she was wounded and laughing nervously on a basement floor keep a single thing he owned. She pursued civil restitution through multiple courts in Minnesota. The process was lengthy, legally complicated, and repeatedly pushed back against. She was fighting a system that had already acknowledged Smith was a murderer, but moved slowly when it came to what that murderer owed the family of the girl he killed. She kept going and did not stop. She gave interviews to Dateline and 48 Hours and used every platform available to her to make sure the public understood that a conviction was only the beginning of what accountability looked like for her family. Her daughter went into that house and made a terrible decision that ended her life. Byron David Smith made a worse one when he decided that a wounded 18-year-old girl laughing nervously at the bottom of his stairs needed one more bullet. Jenny Kyer decided every day after that he was going to spend the rest of his life paying for it.